There we go. All right. Well, I'm not going to redo the intro, but that's okay. That's not the important part. Um, on that page, the Random Review webpage, you'll also find a list of related books compiled by volunteer Gail Gerdeman and links to video recordings of each event. This year, we're streaming all the Random Review events live, so you also have the option to view them from home as they happen. Now then, today's selection is As the Condor Soars. Carl Schreck of the Random Review Committee has volunteered to introduce our presenter.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Selena Happel. Selena is the head of the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences, and the authors of this book are on her faculty. Selena is a marine biologist by training. She has degrees from the University of Washington, North Carolina State, and then Duke. And she got her degree the same time her husband, Scott, got his degree, and he was a reviewer for us last year. It's quite a daunting job that Selena has in our department. I think it's the largest fisheries and wildlife department actually in the world. We have about 900 undergraduate students. About a third of those are on campus. We have about 300 graduate students. About 140 are masters and PhDs, and the others are online masters or also certificate students in fisheries and wildlife. Selena manages a faculty of 44 professors. And in addition to that, we have about 80 courtesy appointments. These are usually agency people who teach a course or something like that. So it's quite a challenge with that many people. In fact, the department employs about 300 people. Selena was selected as our department head about 10 years ago, and she was the worst female in that position. And it's really, as you can imagine, with a program that big, pretty challenging. And in addition to that, she was also president of the Faculty Senate. I think it probably the hardest time the Faculty Senate ever had, because it happened during the pandemic when we had to try to figure out how to run a university. And then secondly, we also had to fire our university president. So with all that, Selena is stepping down after 10 years of service and going back to teaching and research. So with that, Selena, please tell us about As the Condor Soars.
Thank you. I'm actually going to use a lapel mic because I like to walk along with those big stuff. Okay. Thing is flashing. Flashing, flashing, flashing. Any second now. No? No? Oh, we were hoping. Okay, how's that? There we go. Okay, so I will try not to, if it's too loud, let me know. I have a lecture voice and I used to, we need to go up, okay? Yeah, and I also used to sing in opera chorus, so hope I won't be doing that today. But yeah, so let me know if the volume is okay for you. Yeah, and thank you, Carl, for the introduction. I really appreciate the library inviting me here. My husband spoke last year on the Immense World book, and I'm not sure how that got me on the list to talk about this book, but that's great. Except I'm not an ornithologist. But that's okay because I am a closet ornithologist, actually. And so we're going to talk a little bit about birds today. And this really nice book that is actually not just about birds. It's a lot about scientists and history and really the history of ornithology here in Oregon, which means that it has a lot of nice connections in place and people that many of you probably know. In the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences Department, we have a collection of birds that we use in our classes and also for science. And collections, we have also fish and mammals and a few other things. And collections are used for a wide range of purposes. So one thing that we use them for is just to, in classes, so students can see a spotted owl. Now, we can take them out to the woods and show them a spotted owl as well, but they can actually see the feathers and the size of the bird and so on a lot better when they have a specimen that they can look at and handle. So let's see, this one, 3 of the birds up here are from the teaching collection. So they don't have as much detail on their tags as as the ones that are really from the scientific collection. And collecting birds used to be very common. There are bird collections in museums and universities all over the world. We don't collect birds actively too much anymore, but we do take advantage of roadkill, window kill, cat kill. I have 3 or 4 in my freezer right now from over the years. And we just, as long as we have the information about where the bird was found and the date and so on, we can actually add it to our collections, at least for teaching, if not for science. So when we're done today, I hope you'll come up and take a look at the specimens that I brought. I also have a little bit of literature here about our department in case you're curious. And Carl brought up that we do have these online graduate certificates. And I would encourage you, if you've ever just wanted to learn more about fisheries or wildlife management, take a look, because these, if you have a bachelor's degree, you can actually enroll in one of these certificate programs. It's 18 credits. And you can learn all about. We have lots of people who come to our program, after the fact, who just want to learn something new. So you can also take individual courses online through our program. So happy to chat with you about that too. Well, hopefully you had a chance to look at the book, and I have many pages here marked for us to chat about today. But I wanted to start a little more generally, tell you just a little bit about me. So I'm a department head, a professor, an advisor, and a mom. And I have had various administrative roles, as Carl pointed out. I'm a marine fisheries ecologist and conservation biologist, and an amateur birder. This is my husband, Scott, and my son, Dylan. Dylan is now a marine resource management master's student at OSU and is following in our footsteps. He's working on halibut bycatch work here in the Pacific. So pretty cool stuff. Most of my research was on sea turtles and other long-lived marine species, and finding ways to help fishermen avoid catching them, because that leads to endangerment in various parts of the world. And I do a lot of technical work with developing computer simulation models that ask, well, what conservation strategies are likely to work best for this species or that species? So that's the primary work that I was doing with National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and other entities. My very first paper published was a bird paper. So it was on red-cockaded woodpeckers. This is an endangered species from the southeastern U.S. Red-cockaded woodpeckers are very interesting birds. They have family groups where the young males stay at the nest and help raise the fledglings that are their brothers and sisters, basically. And I did a model, a computer simulation model that looked at a variety of management strategies for the birds. And this actually did provide some information to Fish and Wildlife Service about strategies that were more or less likely to work. So basically the percent change in the population growth due to the management strategy, and then this is the population growth rate. So some of the strategies that they were doing weren't likely to lead to population recovery at all. And some were very likely to result in a large increase in population recovery. So those are the kinds of exercises we can do as scientists that will help us make better decisions down the road. So science really helps conservation in a variety of ways. So data collection and analysis is used to even determine if there's actually a problem. We go through a process called biological opinions when there's a species that has been put on, proposed for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And we do a lot of data collection and evaluation of the data to determine if the population is in trouble or its habitat is declining and so on. We use science to evaluate mechanisms for what caused the problem in the first place, and how we might fix it. We use science to add some objectivity to the conservation process, because of course a lot of conservation comes from the heart. And so the science helps provide some objective evaluation of whether the species really is endangered and what the strategies might be to protect it. And then if that evaluation of potential solutions is where most of my work was, what can work and what's not likely to work. And so here's just an example of the kind of work I was doing with the sea turtles, comparing captive rearing, which we call head starting, and turtle excluder devices that keep the turtles out of the shrimp nets so they don't drown. And basically what my analysis showed, this is all from a model. This isn't from actual turtles. It's from a simulation. The actual turtles are here in the red line. So you see my model did a pretty good job, actually. But what this analysis showed was that the captive rearing program was not actually going to lead to population recovery. And captive rearing is something we jump to very quickly, and we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes with regards to condors. Okay? Captive rearing is something that we automatically go to because we think about, oh, you know, especially in the case of like sea turtles, they're very small, they get eaten by lots of stuff. So if we just raise them in captivity for a while and then let them go, then they will survive better and good things will happen. But it turns out that for sea turtles, that doesn't really work. It doesn't make a lot of difference, and it's very expensive. So we can use these kinds of analyses to help advise the decision makers and managers about what to do. The turtle excluder devices are the way to get your population to increase. And that is in fact what they implemented. And the population, this is Kemp's Ridley turtles, and they are now downlisted to threatened and doing quite well. So all good. All right, but let's talk about the book. And I bring all of this up because a lot of this book is about that process of the science and the observations and the conservation, right? So the authors here, well, let me just go over quickly the main parts of the book. It talks about the history of Oregon ornithology, how scientists study birds, avian conservation in Oregon over time, and then by habitat, and looking to the future. And what's interesting about ornithology and Oregon State University is that we have tremendous expertise, but it's across multiple departments. And then it really connects to our courtesy faculty. So the agency scientists that are working in a variety of federal and state agencies that do a lot of this really important and valuable work, and we partner with them. And a good example is the Cooperative Research Unit of the U.S. Geological Survey. And then the authors of this book, primary authors, Sue Haig was with the USGS, with the Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center, and Dan Roby was in the Cooperative Research Unit. So both USGS employees, but very much invested in the university. They advised students, worked with faculty on a lot of research and teaching projects and things like that. So these partnerships are really, really important. And then Tashi and Ram and 37 contributors have written pieces of this book. So it's a nice compilation of lots of expertise. So I feel like this book has something for everybody, right? I mean, if you're not a birder, there's still really interesting stuff in here about sort of the history of science and conservation in our area. Some of my favorite birds, I went through the book and took pictures of some of my favorite birds for the little thing here. And there's there's stuff about art and birds in art. A lot of things in here about citizen science and how people in the community actually contribute to the data that we collect, and all kinds of things like that. So what are some things that resonated for you as you looked at the book? Were there things, were you really drawn to the stories about the science, or more of the history and the people? What are some things that people kind of picked up on? Anybody? In back there?
Yeah, before I even read the book, the photography, just,
Oh, yes.
there's so much incredible photographic art in that book.
Yes, yes, definitely. And birds aren't actually the easiest thing to take good pictures of either. I've tried it. Yeah, that's right. Definitely. What else kind of resonated with folks? Anybody know any of the people in the book? Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, we're a small community, right? So yeah, a lot of the people in this book are from the Corvallis area or are connected to the university and so on, right? Yeah. Yeah. I think the other thing that this book really does is it really focuses on that sense of place and why Oregon is such a unique state, and kind of that element of Oregon about how we do solve problems by working together, even when we disagree on things. So I thought they did a really nice job, especially with the short kind of vignettes and things that are written by the different scientists that contributed. Yeah. The history is really interesting, and there's a few different um, tables in the book that kind of go over history. So one of the first ones is right at the beginning of the book that goes over the state and federal activities of importance to Oregon birds. And, you know, going all the way back to early 1800s and settlement in Oregon, through things like the Endangered Species Act, and then more recent events that have happened in the state. I think in general, you know, we have a strong conservation ethic and stewardship, environmental stewardship ethic in Oregon. And that really comes through when you read kind of the passion and so on from the different authors that comes out in their sections. So let me just give you an example. And I think like a story here about, you know, why do people care about birds? Why do we get excited about birds? Why are scientists scientists for that reason, or for that matter? And I think Donald Kreutzmann has a really nice thing here, and I'm going to read a little bit of it to you, just so you get a sense of where kind of the storytelling that occurs in this book. In 1969, I began a graduate program at OSU under John Weens in the zoology department. Where did you get your song? Was the simple 6-word question that fascinated me. No concrete answers were available for any songbird at that time, anywhere on the planet. Hints from laboratory reared birds, especially white-crowned sparrows, suggested that a young male learned his single song from his father before leaving home. Because the song dialect boundaries of this sparrow can remain highly stable over time, it was thought that those dialect boundaries might act as a barrier to dispersal. That scenario suggested that, left relatively undisturbed over evolutionary time, each dialect could become a distinct species. And maybe that's why there are so many songbird species to begin with. Fascinating. But in my gut, I felt it couldn't be true. That Buick's Wren in my backyard in Corvallis had 16 different songs in his repertoire. 16! Take that, white-crowned sparrows. I smiled, impressed at the wren's vocabulary. I had recorded him on my reel-to-reel Uher recorder for several days. The neighboring territorial wren had some of the same songs in his repertoire, but none of those songs could be found among the wrens at the Finley National Wildlife Refuge. When I further learned that the wren's entire repertoire of songs changed gradually over distance, and only individual songs in the repertoire changed at abrupt boundaries, I realized that a young male simply must learn his song repertoire after dispersing to his own territory, which he would hold for the rest of his life. So, that kind of illustrates the process of how scientists kind of go through, there's an observation, you get excited, curious about it, then you start to dig in, you start to question yourself back and forth. Well, this is what everybody thinks happens out there, but actually, I'm not so sure. And then you start the long, often tedious process of data collection and data analysis to see which of your theories is held up by the evidence. So I found that Kreutzmann's writing here was about the best of that sort of storytelling of how we go through this process of doing science. But there's lots of other really good examples in the book, for sure. So the book is about people, really, and birds, of course. It's about history. It's about Oregon. And it's about conservation. This is my favorite bird in the world, actually. You know what this is? Dipper. Yes, or ouzel. Right? This is a bird that pretends to be a seabird, only in freshwater. And you can see them. We were just up in Bend for the American Fisheries Society meeting a couple weeks ago, and there were dippers along the Deschutes. So fun to watch. And this little bird, they're only little guys, and they go completely underwater in, fast moving water and work their way up the stream, finding caddisflies and other little bugs to eat on the bottom. I love them. They're my favorite. So everybody has a favorite bird, right? So are there favorite birds in the room? What are favorite? Yeah, what's your favorite? Meadowlark. I have one on the table. And Oregon state bird. Yes. What else? Yes.
Peregrine.
Peregrine. I have one of those on the table. Good. Okay, keep going.
We moved from Virginia, so I'll say cardinals.
Ah, cardinals. Yes, we do not have cardinals here. Yes, that's right. I was impressed. I always thought that cardinals, it was like a Rocky Mountains thing, but there's lots of them in Arizona. And we were in the Chiricahua Mountains doing some birding, actually, over New Year's, and saw a few cardinals. What else? Somebody's favorite bird? Yeah.
Jay.
Stellars. Yeah, we have those in our yard in Newport. Yeah, they're great.
About the turkey.
Not turkeys. Yes. I'll tell you a funny story about the turkeys on Witham Hill. I explained to Dylan that the turkeys were not native and so on. And he was like, I don't know, 9 years old or something. I just dropped him on, picked him up from a friend's house. And we come around the corner and there's this turkey right there in the road. And he's like, speed up, Mom. No. We're not going to go slam into a turkey with the car. No. Okay. But yes, there are some really interesting things. Oh, and speaking of which, actually, there's a section of the book that goes over that Contreras has that talks about the different species in Oregon and how that's the recognized species in Oregon have changed over time, right? So 542 species of birds in Oregon. Some of those are new, since we started to count and look. Some of those are introduced birds. Some are lost. A few have been lost. And then some have recovered. So some examples, of course, like bald eagles and peregrine falcon and so on. So, yeah.
So speaking of birding lists, was Lewis and Clark's list of birds the first for Oregon that included the California condor?
So what I saw in here, so they definitely, did talk about California condors. And I don't know that that was the first recorded, in sort of Western science, so to speak. But I would guess it was, for condors in Oregon. That was 1805.
What about the birding list, the concept of a birding list? Bird seen.
When you actually list the birds you've seen. So most of that really comes into play, naturalists doing that kind of work, undoubtedly over long periods, but really comes into play in kind of a scientific kind of way in the mid 1800s. So it's a little bit later, and um, the condors were seen in Oregon and were noted on people's lists up until 1904. And that's the last, for sure, recording of a condor in Oregon. Yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting. And then, people's bird lists change sometimes because of accidentals, that they call a bird that just shows up that's not really supposed to be here, that gets blown in by a storm or something. And so the bird list of 542 is not the accidentals. Those are the birds that live in Oregon. Okay. Yeah, so I was really amazed when I saw that. And, part of it, one of the reasons for that is, I'm going to jump ahead here because I have a map and then I'll back up again. This is a map of habitats. Uh-oh. Oh, there it is. Habitats in Oregon. And one of the reasons why we have so many birds here, and apparently we have more birds than any other northern state. And generally speaking, there are more birds in southern areas than or in lower latitudes than upper latitudes. Okay. But Oregon has such a diversity of different kinds of habitats. So this is a color map that it's from a website I found called databasin.org. And it shows all these different habitat types based on different kinds of primarily vegetation that defines these habitat types. And we have so much change in elevation. We've got the coast, we've got the high desert, and because we have such diversity of habitats, it means we have a high diversity of birds. And we see a lot of variety, and changes over time too, because when a new bird like barred owls come into Oregon, there's plenty of good, interesting habitat to move into. And barred owls and a lot of invasive species, including the green crab that Sylvia studies, are generalists, right? So one of the reasons why they're good at invading is because they can actually occur in a lot of different habitats. So we've been doing a lot of work with the barred owls, the USGS and the US Fish and Wildlife Service and US Forest Service have a program. Barred owls are actually having, they're not so good for spotted owls, as it turns out. Yeah, so that's been a bit of a problem for us that we've been working on. Let me back up a little bit. There's my spotted owl right there. So I did want to point out, since we were talking about history a bit, and some of the folks that have done ornithology in Oregon for a very long time, those write-ups in the book are really interesting. And it includes people, not only scientists, it's mostly the scientists, but also folks who have contributed to ornithology and bird conservation in Oregon. So like the Eltzroths here, get that out of the way. No, it didn't get out of the way. Oh, well, the Eltzroths here, founding members of the Audubon Society of Corvallis, Oregon Birding Association, and Oregon Field Ornithologists, and did a whole lot of work with bluebirds. And Western bluebirds are a good example of a success story in Oregon because of the efforts of people like all of you, right? Putting up bluebird boxes, noting where and when the bluebirds are around, making sure that those nasty invader species like starlings and whatnot stay out of the boxes. So that's all, you know, really great work that we do as a community that's very helpful to birds. And I think that's, so I'm a fish person, but birds just have this other connection with people that, you know, just makes it more of a community effort. And that's why I think so many people are involved in community science when it comes to birds, because we have kind of a soft spot in our hearts for them. And of course, they come to our feeders. We get to observe them doing their bird things and get to see them do lots of really cool behaviors and things. So I did want to point out in the history piece something that Sue and Dan missed, which is that the very first graduate at Oregon State University of what we used to be called the Fish and Game Management Department, that was the original name of our field at OSU. So we were founded back in 1935, and the very first master's student was a woman who worked on pheasants. Okay, and Margaret Whipple, she's mentioned in this Game Commission report from 1937-38. She was an incubator biologist. She was in charge of the incubators. Now, pheasants are not a native species. They're an introduced species that was brought here for hunting, okay? But she did her master's degree on artificial incubation and brooding of ring-necked pheasants. So I just think that's cool that our very first graduate did that work. Some other great labs that we have in the department now, we have our Seabird lab. Rachel Orban works on albatross and wide range of seabirds off the coast here. We have the Betts lab in the forestry, College of Forestry. He works a lot on hummingbirds and species that are in the tropics. They actually put tiny, tiny little transmitters on these hummingbirds that are small enough that the hummingbird can still fly around and do its thing. Really incredible work. Katie Duggar is with the co-op unit, and she works in Antarctica and works with the Daily Penguins, and does a bunch of work with birds and mammals here in Oregon as well. So lots of really neat people, and you know that we do have lectures and things on campus that are open to the public and Zoomed. So I hope you'll keep an eye out for some of those opportunities to meet these folks. And one of the things that they talk about a lot are the different technologies that we use to study birds. So most of us study birds by pulling our binoculars out and, you know, sitting out of the window or walking through the meadow or whatever it happens to be. But scientists that study birds are working with some pretty high-tech stuff, including these transmitters that have to be so tiny so that the bird can still fly. And it's not just that the bird can still fly, it has to be able to fly well. Because there's no point in putting a transmitter on a bird to learn how it behaves if the transmitter affects the behavior, right? And so, but the technology is such now that we can make these really teeny tiny little things that will talk to your cell phone, Bluetooth, you know, various other kinds of technologies that are coming into play. Even something as simple as digital photography has changed a lot in how we do ornithology, because you can set up remote cameras, camera traps, and of course you have ways of taking pictures of birds and getting an immediate photo that you can see, did I, you know, actually get a good picture of that bird so I can tell which bird it is and things like that. Drones. We use drones to chase birds around. One of the primary projects that utilizes drones here in Oregon is for marbled murrelets in the redwood forest. So these are seabirds that nest in redwood trees, very tops of redwood trees, right? Or up in the upper third of it. And so kind of dangerous to send somebody up into the tree, but you can send a drone up with a thermal camera on it to find where the nesting bird is. Pretty neat stuff. Acoustics is a big one now, and the reason why we can do part of the reason we can do so much more with acoustics, so putting out microphones, listening for birds and so on, is that we also have big computers and AI, artificial intelligence, that can analyze all of those recordings. So it used to be you could, do your recordings for sure, but then somebody had to go through and listen to all of those recordings and see them through an oscilloscope and so on and so forth. And now we have more automated ways of analyzing those data and really big computers that can handle the giant files that are generated by those. Something we call stable isotopes. So in chemistry, all elements have multiple isotopes, right? With different amounts of protons and neutrons. And those can be detected in birds. So an example of this is we can tell if birds, like a seabird, like these common murres, okay, we can actually, without hurting the bird, pluck feathers and use stable isotope analysis to determine what kind of food that bird was eating.
Oh,
If it was eating food, and a real good example of this actually that Rachel Urban and others have worked on is we can determine if the bird has been primarily feeding on the leftover fish that come off of fishing boats versus its normal prey. It's pretty amazing stuff. Yeah. And then eDNA. So in the environment, there's lots of DNA floating around. And we can use eDNA to detect birds, looking at the stomach contents, for example, of a barred owl to see what prey we're eating that we can't identify because it's been too digested. We can collect environmental samples and detect DNA from different species, and lots of different cool stuff like that. So that's where I get excited because I feel like our science has moved beyond the days of putting big collars on animals and seeing where they walk around. And now we have much better ways to evaluate, like, where do birds live? What kind of habitat needs do they have? How far do they move? Satellite transmitters that tell us where seabirds have gone all over the place and things like that. So, yeah, cool stuff.
Is the antenna?
All right, so spotted owls. Yeah. Everybody remember the big controversies? Well, it's not like it's over, but it was really big in the 80s and 90s, right? And we have a lot of policy and actual changes to the Endangered Species Act and other things that came because of the controversies over spotted owls and their need for old growth habitat. So spotted owls are slow, they live a long time. They're kind of on the slow end of the spectrum, we like to think of them, because what that means is that they can't grow, their populations can't grow really fast because they don't have very many chicks. They tend to live a long time, but they're sort of, they mature a little bit later, and they're not like a sparrow or something that can have lots and lots of offspring very quickly and have a fast population growth rate. And it's not just that they prefer old growth, they actually require it in order to have successful reproduction. They just don't do well in secondary growth or tertiary growth forests. So they need trees that are 100+ years old. And there's not that many places left in the Northwest that have trees that are over 100 years old. And so that was a big deal with trying to figure out how to change harvest policies in Oregon to make sure that these birds didn't go extinct. And a lot of folks here in Corvallis were involved in that work, in doing the science to determine what do the birds really need, how many are there, and do they really need old growth, or can they get by on other things? Can we supplement them in some way? You know, lots of different things that were tried and tested with spotted owls. Anybody remember that time and anything about that time that really stuck out for you? People got kind of nasty. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you can't really, I mean, we're talking about people's livelihoods, right? Especially small timber owners. Right? So there's the warehousers of the world that don't want the birds to get in the way of what they need to do. But there's also the small time landowners who are trying to figure out how to manage their property and make a living. Yeah.
I think if I remember, there was some president that said if you've seen one redwood, you've seen them all.
Yeah, that would be Reagan. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I saw them all.
Yeah. Right. Has anybody seen a spotted owl? Yeah. What's so cool about them is that they're not really afraid of people and they come out during the day. I've seen them in MacDon. Yeah. And they'll come and they'll just sit on a branch and look at you. And they're very cute too. Yeah. Yeah.
What is it about? You ever figure out what it's about the old growth that is a requirement?
Yeah, so it seems to be they have a pretty restricted diet. And so they need the rodents, voles and things like that that are also associated with old growth. And so that's where the spotted owl really just became like an umbrella species. It wasn't just the spotted owl that we were concerned about. It's all these other species that are only associated with those old trees that were really important. Yeah. So Katie Duggar now is in charge of the Spotted Owl Project, but there's a lot in the book about Eric Forsman, Bob Anthony, and others who worked with our department and worked with the agencies on this very iconic species. We have a new problem with spotted owls, which is the barred owl. So unfortunately, I actually almost brought a barred owl with me today too, but they're mostly not in very good shape because the lab that works on them mostly takes them apart to see what they've been eating. So the skins aren't that great to take a look at, but the barred owls are more of an East Coast species, and they moved here naturally. And there's still some speculation about how that all occurred and exactly when it occurred. But most of the maps I've seen show them kind of moving through Canada and then coming down the Pacific coast. And the problem is that a barred owl is a little bit bigger than a spotted owl, and they are generalist predators. So they eat everything. And here's a couple of jars of things out of barred owl stomachs, which includes a mouse. Sure, you figure they would eat mice, right? But they also eat crayfish, salamanders, basically anything they can find. Now, they eat rats in my yard here in Corvallis, so I appreciate that. I've seen them, you know, that's fine. And if they stuck to urban environments, that'd actually probably be a great thing. The problem is that they also like old growth forest, and they pick on spotted owls. And in areas where they overlap, spotted owls are declining. So all the good things that we were able to do with saving forests are now kind of being undermined by this invasive species. It's a little bit of a different sort of invasive species though, because it got here on its own. It's not like we did, well, our forestry practices may have had something to do with it, but it wasn't like somebody released barred owls intentionally. But we do have a lot of them, and that is ongoing work now that is talked about here in the book. Yeah.
See, they're around our.
Well, let's look at another example, which is the Caspian terns eating salmon. All right, what do you do when you have one protected species eating another protected species? It gets complicated, I can tell you that. So Caspian terns are a fish predator. And Dan Roby and others did a lot of work on trying to determine, you know, how much salmon they actually eat, and then what we can do about it. And what happens with the Caspian terns is that it was actually a really great win-win sort of situation because the birds were nesting on an island that was upstream, and a lot of salmon were getting eaten by these birds because of sort of where they were nesting, and it was close by to where on the Columbia River. And then so the idea that Dan and other folks had was, well, what if we move the birds downstream to more of the estuary areas where there's other things to eat besides salmon? Because there's lots of different fishes that live in the estuaries. And so they had this big project where they made the islands that are closer to the mouth of the river more compatible for nesting birds. And then they hazed the birds off of the island that was upstream. So, loud noises. And then after they got the birds to stop nesting there, they planted lots of bushes and things so that they couldn't nest on the sand anymore. And ultimately, yes, the Caspian terns moved to the other island and their diets switched to only having about 30% salmon instead of 80 or 90% salmon. So sometimes the science gives us an idea of a solution that can actually be beneficial, to all parties. Unfortunately, those win-win situations don't happen too often, but at least we can work together to try to find things like that. Caspian terns they're a pretty big tern, and they eat a wide variety of different fishes and things. They also did work on this project to see how many hatchery salmon were eaten versus wild salmon, because of course that's really important for promoting the recovery of the wild salmon. And all along, everybody agreed birds eating salmon are not the primary reason why we don't have salmon. Okay. But if it's a situation where the predator is really eating a lot of that endangered species, then we do have to do something, or the agency that's monitoring that species has to do something. So this was an example where moving some birds around actually solved a problem. Now the emphasis is on cormorants. So you may have heard about the cormorant issues, and whether it's that the cormorants are eating too much salmon or they're pooping too much on the bridges. Either way, there's concerns about there being too many cormorants. So different strategies for how to manage birds and when they get into high abundances like that. And then the sage grouse. So Christian Hagen is courtesy faculty with our department, and he works on sage grouse and other species that live in the arid parts of our state. And these are amazing birds. If you ever have a chance to go see them, the males here have these incredible displays. Have you seen a video or something of it? And it makes this boom, boom, boom sort of sound of these air sacs that they blow up on their chests. And the reason why they're doing that, this is what I think is very cool, is that they are displaying for females in this little arena that's called a lek, L-E-K. And they do these displays, and they just are showing the female that they are the best, man. They're the healthiest. They don't have any parasites. They have the prettiest feathers. They are going to be the best genes possible for her, because he's not going to help her at all with actually raising the chicks. All he's going to do is strut around, and then there'll be one here, and there'll be one 50 feet away, and another one, and they just are doing this, and the females are just looking around and checking out each one, and then decide which one they're going to mate with based on his display and sounds and other things that he's making. So really interesting, and that's what I love about birds, I guess almost as much as I love fish. Because they do so many different kinds of behaviors and things. So another thing to read about in the book. Let's see, I just have a couple more. Oh, and I just wanted to finish with the condors, right? Because that is the um, namesake for the book. And California condors are quite an iconic species. They got down to such low numbers, primarily they think, what Jesse talks about in the book, is that, you know, their populations may have declined for other reasons. I kind of wonder about loss of big large herds of big mammals, and possibly even salmon, because, you know, a bird this size needs a lot of dead stuff to eat, right? Um, but the last one, I think I mentioned, the last one was seen in Oregon in 1904. And they were still in California for a bit, but their numbers were really in trouble. And ultimately, they brought the last few into captivity. And they discovered first that so condors are another one of these slow species. Okay, they take a long time to reach maturity. They only have one egg at a time and so on. But if you take the egg away from a mother condor, she will lay another egg. So they had this program where they would take an egg out and then she would lay another egg, and that was to try to double the reproductive output of the last few remaining condors. And but ultimately they ended up all in captivity. There's interesting videos that you can see of this where they were trying to, you know, like they didn't want to habituate the chicks too much to humans, so they have these like hand puppets to feed the chicks and things like that. And they've actually released a fair number of these birds in California now, and now the Yurok tribe in particular is pressing for releases in Oregon. And so a lot of that, it takes a long time to do the science and get everything kind of arranged to do a release like that. But that is the plan, is to actually get condors back in Oregon. And we see them occasionally because they cross over because they don't know where the border between Oregon and California is, right? But the hope is that we can actually have breeding population again here. So, but a big problem, and one of the reasons why they think that the population wasn't able to recover on its own, is because of contamination. And there's a few things in the book about contaminants. You know, everybody remember Silent Spring and DDT, DDE, these other contaminants that we were using in pesticides and so on. So that was a real problem for raptors in general. That's why our peregrines and other species, bald eagles, really went downhill. Once those chemicals were banned and started to disappear from the environment, then the thing that really seemed to be problematic was lead and lead ammunition. So when people hunt, if the ammunition is such that it you know, either shotgun pellets or rifle bullets that shatter, that make a lot of shrapnel, the birds eat that, and then they get that lead poisoning. And for condors, that's a pretty big deal. So that's part of the effort, is to try to get hunters to use different kinds of ammunitions. One of our professors, Clint Epps, actually has done some work on this to see, and he is an avid hunter, to see what kinds of ammunition actually work, and see if we can solve some of that problem. So the captive rearing thing, I mean, you could argue we don't really have the right kind of habitat and so on left for these birds. We're all the way down to just a few individuals left. Should we be going to these kinds of extreme efforts? I mean, millions of dollars to save the last few condors. In this particular case, condors, we actually seem to have done it. We managed to get them to turn the corner, and we have hundreds of them again now. But that's a huge, huge effort. And so I always tell my students, you know, of course, we want to intervene, so to speak, well before we get to that point where we have to bring the last few individuals into captivity. But it's an interesting thing to think about, you know, and as we have climate change and other things affecting habitat, you know, where are we going to put our energies, and how, you know, how do we feel about it? You know, kind of that stewardship and responsibility to take care of nature, but also a little bit of pragmatism that has to come into play. So the class I teach to our seniors is problem solving in fisheries and wildlife, and we debate things like that. And the students pull out the, you know, get the science on the table and talk about it from a science perspective, but then we also talk about it from an ethics perspective and so on. So that's where the public input really has to come in.
Then you see
Have I seen a
one, and then you see one. Then you go to the national park and you see.
and you actually go see them?
And then your heart.
And then
is
your
in
heart,
it.
exactly, I know, for sure.
They're-
Well, and the fact that the tribes want these species back too. I mean, so that really changes the conversation. We were talking in my class last year about Sacramento Chinook. So Sacramento Chinook, the Sacramento, with climate change now, the Sacramento, and the fact that we use the Sacramento for so many other things, means it's not a good place for salmon. Okay, but the tribes really want their salmon back. And so that does become part of the discussion, for sure.
Complicated.
It does. It is complicated. That's the other thing that we emphasize is that you might go into fisheries and wildlife because you love nature and you want to be outside all the time and you don't want to talk to people. The reality is that it's mostly about talking to people. Yes. That's right. All right. Well, so let's think about what we can do for our bird friends here. Lots of things, right? You can watch them, you can count them, you can love them. You can protect them, of course, and there's a variety of ways to do that. Everything from putting bells on your cat or keep it indoors, all the way through supporting legislation to protect birds and their habitats. Support government and university research. I think this is a really important time to put that plug in. Because that's where a lot of this important work is done, and to make sure that we're making good decisions that are based on objective science. And then I encourage you, if you love birds, to become a citizen scientist. And so, you know, we have things like Doug Robinson's Oregon 2020 effort, which is a statewide bird counting project. And if you are at least an amateur birder, you can contribute to the data set that they're doing all over the state to get a nice, it's to compare to historical records, and then also to contribute, you know, create a baseline for where were we in 2020, so that we can look at that in the future. And then, so this is just a map of their general, the areas where they're doing regular counts. And then some of you have heard of eBird, I hope. You know about eBird? So you can, if you know a little bit about birds or you love birds, you can get this app for your phone and you can go for a walk and identify birds and send them into the Cornell lab, and your record will become part of this huge database that has been able to actually map a lot. We know so much more about migration and distribution and how distributions of birds are changing because of citizen science, because of amateur birders just contributing to that data set, because scientists can't be in so many places all the time. Right. So, and we're actually doing a lot of that work in fisheries now too, getting people on the water to collect data and contribute to the greater data sets. I want to let you all know that somebody who is mentioned in the book, Jonathan Weens, is going to be in town and he's doing a book signing. He has a new book called Becoming an Ecologist, and he will be on campus on April 15th. And I would encourage you to come and meet him. And we would love to see you on campus too. So any questions or other things I could talk to you about, or you can come up and see our birds here? Yeah.
Inevitable question, how is your funding in terms of the political?
Well, yeah, so at the moment, very little has been actually cut off. We're sort of waiting. Yeah, and it's very unclear what will be cut, and to what extent. We're actually waiting this week to hear about Department of Interior and NOAA as the kind of next on the chopping block kind of thing. And where that really comes down is how they decide to do the cuts. So if they tell an agency like NOAA 30% cut, well, are they going to cut whole programs, or are they going to cut, you know, kind of across the board? As long as the agency itself can decide how to make the cuts, then it's probably going to be less impactful, but we'll see. Yeah, yeah. We have a regular thing where if any of our grants have what we call a stop order, where we get a notification that we can't spend money on that grant anymore, that we immediately report it to our Office of Sponsored Programs, our research office, and they tell us what to do and how long that stop order is likely to be in place, and things like that. So far in our department, Carl mentioned we have 140 PhD and master's students. I know of 2 students that have completely lost their funding. And that was because they were working on diversity, equity, and inclusion projects. There will be others, undoubtedly, and I have been working with OSU Foundation on campaigns that we can put in place to start raising money to make sure that students can finish their degrees. Yeah. Question over here.
You mentioned eBird.
Yeah.
What about iNaturalist? How do you compare iNaturalist with eBird?
Yeah, so iNaturalist is also, you know, an opportunity to contribute, and you can upload your photos and things like that. iNaturalist is not really designed to create data that can be used for science. iNaturalist is more about encouraging people to record what they see. And then those data could be used, if they're verified and so on, by scientists in the future. eBird, you actually do go through, like, you tell eBird where you're walking and for how long. And so there's additional metadata, we call it, information that is recorded for each of your observations. And what that does is it creates more information about that data point that you've created that then scientists can use in their analyses.
So when I take a picture of a bird or a
Yeah.
plant or a snake,
Mhm.
there's a documentation that gives the date, time, and place
There is.
to a national database.
Yes.
And I can pull that up, or somebody else can pull it up.
Yes.
They can see where the location is.
Absolutely.
That seems simpler to me.
It is, for sure. The problem with it is that you're not recording when you don't see something. So when you go on an eBird walk, you set the timer and you tell it what you saw over some period of time. And if you don't see any birds, no birds get recorded. So the problem with iNaturalist and some other programs is that it doesn't record zeros. And those zeros can be pretty important if you're trying to say there's lots of birds here and not so many there. That said, those records with the photos and so on and so forth really help with like, wait a minute, how is it that somebody saw a you know, ruby-throated hummingbird in Antarctica? What? Right? So we can actually go back and look at the photo and where it was taken and all that and verify things. So yes, it is still important data. It's just collected in a little bit different way. Yeah. Yeah.
Not exactly sure of the correct name. I would hazard 2 possible names. One is chicken vulture, the other is turkey vulture.
Mhm.
See them even here in Corvallis, and they're masters of hovering on.
Yes, the turkey vultures.
I think they're very similar to what I saw as a kid in Salinas and Monterey, California.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure if it's the same thing or not.
Yeah.
Very similar, and we used to call them buzzards.
Yeah, they have a variety of common names. Birds aren't quite as bad as fish when it comes to common names, but yes, so there's turkey vultures and there's black vultures, and we have primarily turkey vultures here. And so if you see that red head, you know it's a turkey vulture. They have that bare, red head. And turkey vultures, are basically quite common from the coast, well, pretty much all over the state, but quite a few here in the valley, yes. And that's what you're seeing are the turkey vultures. And yes, what they're doing is they're hovering on what we call thermals, so it's warm air that's come up from the land. And so they're not necessarily circling around something dead. They may just be riding one of those air thermals that's rising with temperature.
Really know how to use them.
Yeah, they do. I mean, they're amazing to watch, but especially given how big they are.
Some of the vultures, I've been here about 25 years. I was flabbergasted to see what I think of as a real vulture on the roof, and there was roadkill. in
Yeah.
the House,
Yeah.
and I didn't even know that they were in the area.
Uh-huh.
Right? There are-
Yeah, they're around and they do a lot of, I don't know, sometimes they just kind of act like crows, right? Even though they're so much bigger. And you can, they have them at the Oregon Coast Aquarium too. They have some in captivity there that you can see close up. So yeah. And of course, they're really good garbage cleanup crew, right? For roadkill and whatnot. But they do get hit by cars sometimes if they're not quick enough to get out of the way. Yeah. Well, we're after time, but let's go ahead. Just a couple more. Yeah.
Condors are also referred to as buzzards.
Oh, sure. Condors, sure,
I grew
could
up
be
about
called
10
buzzards.
miles from the Condor Sanctuary in Southern California where they were all captured. And then I applaud that you mentioned the tens of millions of dollars that we collectively spent to save them. And then there's an ethics question that you brought up. Is that kind of input made on across the board to a variety of species that, for example, and I just off the wall, who cares about monarch butterflies? Why should we give a rip?
That's right.
And why do we care about
Yeah.
we just spend a lot of money on?
Yeah,
And is that question asked in
sure. Yeah, so for folks online, so this is kind of getting into the ethics of endangered species management and recovery and conservation and so on. So first thing I'll say is that the science doesn't answer a question of should we do those things, right? So those are ethical questions. Those are questions about stewardship. Those are questions about what society thinks should or shouldn't happen. And we have an Endangered Species Act that says we should not let our animals go extinct. And we should also protect their habitats. But those conversations happen a lot, yes. But because we have these well ingrained, the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. It's been challenged pretty regularly, but every time it comes out, it doesn't always come out completely unscathed. There are amendments and things that are added. The sea turtle controversy was a big one that I worked on because, and that leads to changes in the law. And laws are constantly being updated and changed. But what the science piece does is it helps us provide some data to say, is there actually a problem and why? And what are some things we might be able to do about it? When we get down to the level of a few black-footed ferrets or a few condors or whatever it is, it ends up costing tens of millions of dollars, sometimes more, to recover that species. So really the message is monitor things and try to fix the problem before you get to that level. Because a lot of times captive rearing doesn't work because the animals can't survive in the wild, or their habitat's completely gone anyway, right? So then you end up with a fully captive population. So yeah, but the answer, short answer is yes, those ethical questions are asked, but at the same time, we do have legislation in place that says this, you know, this is what we do and this is what we don't do.
So educating our legislators is beneficial always.
Yeah, I can tell you there's two things that I should have brought up is that, the process of getting a species listed and then the process to get them delisted is really involved. And tens of millions of dollars spent there too, right? Because that's where all that science comes into play, where lots of considerations are on the table. The other thing that's really important to point out is like the work that we do here and as scientists and so on, a lot of regulations referring to how we treat animals in science. So animal care and use is a big part of what we do. So when we want to do any experiments with animals in the lab or working with them in the field, we have very strict regulations about how we work with those animals and the training we have to work with those animals. Yeah. All right. Well, please come up and look at my bird. And thank you so much. And I hope you enjoy the book and learn a lot from it.